All right, thank you all so much for joining us for an evening with crime writer John. I should have practiced this, John Nardizzi. How am I doing?
Nardizzi.
Nardizzi. Okay.
That is fine.
Yeah. So John is a private investigator for the Innocence Project, and he's quite an accomplished author, as we'll learn. So he's here to discuss his latest crime novel, The Burden of Innocence. The book was a Shamus Award finalist. It was selected by the Private Eye Writers of America as a Best Private Investigator Paperback of 2022. John will also discuss his work as a private investigator for the aforementioned New England Innocence Project, and a little bit more about John. So again, award-winning writer and investigator. His crime novels have won praise for its crackling dialogue and pithy observations of detective work. And as I mentioned, he's earned a Shamus Award nomination. He speaks and writes about investigations in numerous settings, including World Association of Detectives, Lawyers Weekly, Pursuit Magazine, and PI Magazine. His work on innocence cases led to the exoneration of Gary Cifizari and James Watson, which he was awarded the Arc of Justice for the Watson case in 2021, as well as $1 million settlements for clients Dennis Marr and the estate of Kenneth Waters, whose story was featured in the film Conviction. And I again want to thank the Friends of the Library and Corning Foundation for sponsoring tonight's event. So all 50 plus of us who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give John a big virtual round of applause for joining us here tonight. And John, I apologize for the mispronunciations, and you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Robert. That's a great introduction. The Italian names will always mess up a presentation, but you did fantastic on them. My own family, we pronounce that name multiple different ways, so we're good. Thank you. And Robert, what a great introduction. I tuned in last week to see how this went, and he did another fantastic job last week. So I want to thank Robert and the Friends of the Library and all the sponsors. Events like this have always been very important to me in my life because I've discovered really my career as a private investigator by attending events like this. And I spent, hours and hours in the library as a kid, reading detective novels and practicing my writing and eventually becoming a novelist. So I want to start by just telling you about the book, a little bit about it. It's The Burden of Innocence. It talks about two fictional detectives who try to free an innocent man. And my PI firm, we work on all kinds of cases, civil, criminal trials, business fraud cases. But a large portion of my work is now doing work on the New England Innocence Project cases, which are cases where a client is in prison and has a claim of actual innocence. So it's a little bit different than an appeal. The standard is very, very high. We have to basically produce new evidence. The appeals have been exhausted, and that involves extensive research. Sometimes there are medical issues that come up in these cases, new technologies, and especially witness interviewing, which you can imagine ties in very well to crime fiction. So I've done talks like this in front of private investigators at different conferences and also writers' conferences, Sleuth Fest in New England. I'm going to be at the New England Crime Bake in the fall, Left Coast Crime in Florida. And I kind of tailor a little bit for PIs or readers. I think tonight, obviously, more on the reader side. And I do have a screen share that I want to do, but it's not going to be on the full time. We discovered a little bit of a malfunction with the software that I use, so I should be able to do it, but it's not going to be able to run constantly. And I didn't want you just to see me as a tiny little talking head at the top of the screen. So you're going to have to suffer through seeing giant skull the entire presentation. So let's start out. What are innocence cases? So again, innocence cases are a person who's in prison has an actual claim of innocence. They're not appeals. Basically, investigators act like investigative reporters on these cases. So we go out and we talk to people years after the fact. Sometimes some of our cases are from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s would be considered a pretty new case. and we gather all that evidence together. Sometimes these cases go on for 8-9 years. Other times we get a really quick turnaround. It really varies. You got to be really patient on these cases. In terms of writing, some of my big influences were, I was going through my bookcase and I remembered my old Robert B. Parker novel, which I think you can see here. These are from the 1980s. Catskill Eagle, one of my favorite books. I was a huge Robert B. Parker fan. Eventually, I came to read some other writers in the genre, like Patricia Highsmith, Stranger on a Train, for example, Jim Thompson, The Grifters, and James Crumley. I love the way that they described scenes and the images that they would pop up in their books. And I can't say that I write like them, but I mean, that was kind of what I was aiming for when I wrote crime fiction. And I think that, the genre has always lent itself to sort of great writing, poetic writing. And I think it's a wonderful, some of the best writing I think is in this genre. So one question I sometimes get is why not just write true crime? Like, why not just write about these cases and just do it as a true crime book? One reason as a writer that I haven't yet finished a book about one of these cases. I think you can do things in a crime novel that you can't in nonfiction. So basically, writing is like painting a picture that grabs you emotionally. I can do broad strokes and get you the essence of some of these cases in a crime novel. When we are compiling the data, as you can imagine, to overturn a conviction, that's nitty-gritty work that goes on. The level of detail, we have to get everything exactly right. So the crime fiction is about shadings, it's about tones, it's about the poetry and the kind of the underlying, you might say, the deep story. So that's one reason that I decided to write two crime novels about a private detective. And the other question I always get is why do we think crime novels are so popular? And I think, again, as a writer, it's because I think I'm dealing with my own stresses from working on these innocence cases. I sometimes feel like I have my own family, that, my wife and my kids, and then I have these other families that are depending on me. And I kind of, maybe that's my own burden of innocence, to get these guys out, get them out of prison. And there's always a feeling that no matter what you're doing, there's always more work to be done. So, and I think for readers, readers like to see and judge why do people commit crimes? How do you deal with that? How do you recognize that? How do you recognize maybe a threat from somebody, or how do you read into a con man? I mean, some of the greatest crime fiction describes how con men operate and how they manipulate people. So again, going back to Robert B. Parker, I realize now that fact and fictional detectives have always been involved in my life. Even though I read Robert B. Parker, I never realized that I could actually work and make a living as a private detective, which is kind of bizarre because I really did love those books. And, the guy wakes up late. He wakes up at like 10 o'clock. This is Spenser, of course, in the Parker novels. He stays out late. He has dinners. That appealed to me. It still appeals to me. I don't really, I tend to have a later type of a job because I'm oftentimes seeing witnesses in the evening or at night. But I never really thought that I could make a living doing it. And let me share something with you here. This was the Tenderloin district of San Francisco is where I went to law school. And San Francisco was home to some of the most famous fictional detectives. And of course, right here, we see Humphrey Bogart as Sam Spade in the great movie, The Maltese Falcon. And his creator, of course, is Dashiell Hammett, who wrote all those wonderful crime novels. Hammett himself was actually a private detective, which a lot of people don't know. And as you can see, it's kind of funny looking at these pictures together. You can see how Bogart sort of almost copied Hammett's demeanor and hat and everything else. But when I was in San Francisco, I went to law school in the Tenderloin, and I actually had friends that lived in this building. This is 891 Post Street in San Francisco. It was later discovered to be the home of Dashiell Hammett. Some people think Sam Spade actually, I think in the books, operated from here as well. And so I drank some beers with different people in different rooms in there that I went to law school with. And I can tell you, you can't really tell here, but there was a lot of, let's just say, criminal activity in the 90s that was occurring in this area. So it's not really a Tony area of San Francisco. It's kind of rough and tumble. It's in the area known as the Tenderloin. And so again, these fictional detectives everybody knows about San Francisco, but what is less well known is San Francisco is also home to some of the most well-known private detective agencies in the United States. And I was attending law school, and I had a fateful day when my writing interests in my interest in the legal field kind of combined. And I went to a law school conference just like this, except it was in person. And one of the speakers was a private detective named Jack Palladino. And he was describing this job working as a private detective. And it combined a lot of my love of writing and investigative reporter. And I basically harassed Jack Palladino for over a year while I was in law school. I kept calling his office, trying to get meetings with him. And he was from Boston, he was Italian. So I had a lot of angles. I'd invite him out for dinner, I'd invite him out for cappuccino, whatever it took. And eventually his receptionist called me and she said, he actually gets a kick out of you calling all the time because you're being very polite. And that's part of what you're going to have to do if you work as a detective, to keep staying on people without irritating them. So eventually I did meet with him, and he ended up taking me on, and I began working in law school for this private detective agency. Palladino was just one of many agency that stemmed from an older company called the Lipset Agency. I just want to show you this because Hal Lipset was known as the dean of detectives. He transformed the world of private eyes. And Lipset worked in the 1950s up to the 1990s. I remember he would sometimes call the office when I was working in San Francisco. He testified in Congress actually in the 1960s. This famous case, you may remember, the Olive and the Martini. That's actually the title of a book as well. And he was trying to demonstrate that the technology advanced such that an olive in a martini could actually be a bug. It could be a recording device. So the olive itself was the recording device. The toothpick was the antenna. He testified in Congress and kind of used this as an example of how an individual could use this to sort of fight the larger forces maybe of the government or even big business. And when I was working in this agency, there were other people too that came along. For example, Lipset himself ended up being an advisor on this Francis Ford Coppola film, The Conversation. One of the investigators who worked there before me, Josiah Thompson, wrote Reflections in a Private Eye. And then one of my colleagues ended up writing a book a couple of years ago, Ella McGarrihan, Two Truths and a Lie. So it was this really rich kind of environment. It was almost like a literary salon combination private detective agency. And I started writing down my stories as I was working. I had worked in the Tenderloin doing some criminal defense cases in law school. I did a case in Iowa involving the El Forester motorcycle gang. I had another case in Seattle that involved prostitutes from the 1960s. And I would start to jot down these short stories and poems, and I was doing poetry readings and submitting short stories. And people would look at me a little bit sideways, like, how do you know these people? Like, what's it all about? How do you get to know these kinds of folks? And when you do these interviews with people, they give you gold. So even if you're interviewing people about a particular case, sometimes they say something that has nothing to do with the case. But as a writer, it just lets out a light bulb goes off, and you think that I can use this little detail in a book because that quote is just so fantastic. And I have to give my father some credit. I don't know if he's watching tonight, but he was a big Robert B. Parker fan, and I was telling him about these poetry readings and kind of joking about it. And one night he said, poetry is great, but why don't you actually make some money and write a crime novel? So he kind of put the impetus into me to actually put everything together, and I ended up writing my first novel, which is Telegraph Hill, where a private eye named Ray Infantino searches for a missing girl named Tania, and he discovers that she's not actually missing, she's a witness, and she's fleeing a criminal gang in San Francisco. So you can see how everything sort of comes together. You know, I'm using all these sort of experiences to sort of basically fuel my writing, and they fuels it back and forth. You know, that's how I look at it. So I'm very lucky to have this sort of maybe dual career. So fast forward a couple years, I end up coming back to Boston, and I eventually go out on my own and I start my own company, my own PI agency. And again, I got very lucky. In 2003, I went to a conference where they were talking about this kind of new area of the law. And this new area was innocence cases or wrongful convictions. And most of the early cases revolved around DNA. And everybody sort of knows these DNA cases where, you know, little bits of the culprit's DNA is left at a crime scene, and it's great, and you can test it and you can identify the person. You see these stories all the time. Everybody sort of understands it. Everybody gets it now. What people don't really understand is that DNA doesn't exist on most cases. It probably exists on maybe 20% of murder cases. So if you think about an average shooting case, a gun case, there's not going to be any DNA unless you get that gun. And even if you get the gun will probably be wiped clean. So they got all these early cases, the low-lying fruit, you might say. And at this particular conference, some of the speakers were getting up and they said, what we really need to carry this wave forward is we need private detectives to take these cases. And I have the stroke of luck of I'm not a retired cop. You know, I never worked as a police officer, so I had no issue with taking these kinds of cases. In fact, I relished the opportunity because I just thought it was this fantastic new area. And, you know, facts and intelligence, PIs are everywhere. We're working on corporate cases, we're working on civil cases, but we still work for individuals. And these cases really go right back to kind of that idea that Hammett had in his book, where a PI is working for an individual person in prison, smashing up against the same kind of corruption, the same kind of unfeeling government blockade where they can't get documents, they can't get evidence, they shouldn't be in prison. And these cases take you to a dark place. And, you know, it's become a huge part of my life. And as I started to work on these cases for the last 10 to 15 years, I realized that this is novel number 2. This is going to be the Burden of Innocence. So again, I didn't want to just write one book about just one of the cases. I wanted to put it in a PI novel, in the form of a PI novel. And oddly enough, too, the PI novel, I think in the last 10 to 15 years has sort of stretched. So when you go to a writing conference, and you can go down onto a bookstore, you'll see sort of these divisions. So it used to be just crime fiction or private detective mysteries. And then it became legal thrillers, you know, written by lawyers, or cozy mysteries, and so on, noir, you know, noir fiction. There's all these genres now. And one of the interesting things is I keep seeing is so many of these books have the character basically doing the work as a private detective. So a couple of years ago, I was at a conference and a panel of writers were on a legal thriller. They were all attorneys talking about these legal thrillers that they were writing. And some of them were like park rangers who had written about a park ranger doing investigations, and the lawyers were doing their own investigations. I can tell you that lawyers don't do investigations. The private investigators, defense investigators do that part of it. The lawyers do the lawyering. There's a reason for that, because they're not trained to do it, and it's a different skill set. And I remember one of the writers sort of made a misinformed comment about all private investigators do in the modern era is sit behind a desk and do database research, and that's just not accurate. And, you know, do we use technology? Of course we do. We use databases. We use GPS trackers when permissible. We use small cameras, mini cameras. But the oldest investigative technique in the world is talking to strangers about difficult things. That's what the heart of it is. And when you talk to people, they sometimes tell you these incredible things about their life, and somebody has to weave that together. And that's the role of the fact investigator, whether it's called a defense investigator, a private investigator, an innocence investigator, or a lawyer who's actually doing the work of an investigator in a legal thriller. So I started writing the second novel based on this case. And my book, The Burden of Innocence, is kind of a mystery in reverse, in the sense that you start off with a scene in prison, so you know that this man has been convicted of the crime, but it's got the street action, it's got the prison scenes, it moves quickly, the action is there, like a classic Parker novel, but it also has a dose of how the work is actually done. And in this particular case, private detectives Ray Infantino and Tania take on the case of Sam Langford, framed for a murder that was committed by a crime boss at the height of his powers years ago. So Boston has changed, though. So the ethnic tribes, the Irish and the Italian gangs, are now weaker, and prosecutions have weakened these gangs. So as these two detectives start going across the city interviewing witnesses, they realize that a corrupt cop and one of the gangsters are trying to derail their investigation. So they know that the old bones won't stay buried forever. And the question is, can Ray and Tania solve the case in time to free an innocent man? So each witness comes on stage at some point, and you can see how people, the witnesses are the stars. You know, lawyers always think they're the stars of the case, but it's really the witnesses that make a case. Why do witnesses lie? How can a police officer get a confession from a witness maybe that's not true? All this stuff happens in these real cases. And I tried to show how these things can happen in the crime novel as well. So I have 3 witnesses in the book that I sort of focus on. And there's different parts of the book where it's from the perspective of the detective, other parts are from the perspective of the different witnesses. So from the perspective of the detective, Ray Infantino, at one point he's thinking about how bad this case is and how horrible it is. And he's going through the documents, and it's exhausting sometimes. And you know, you can see that's oftentimes how we feel, you know, when we see how bad these cases actually are. And he says trials were built on characters like this. While the court system relied on an ancient facade of power, marble columns that were called Greek and Roman temples, black-robed judges with solemn voices recalling the devotion of monks, the fact was that cases orbited around more shabby and tawdry things. Damaged characters took on starring roles, mouthing their lines and disappearing off screen, never to be seen again. From the perspective of the witness, they always have different attitudes when we come to see them years later on a case. They're fearful sometimes they're concerned. Sometimes a witness will say something like, "I've been waiting 20 years for someone like you." That's that makes your day. That's incredible, that feeling when somebody says that. Other witnesses are a mix of emotions and a mix of feelings. So one witness in the case is named Joey Butters, and he was a low-level guy in this gang, and he's interviewed by the detective Ray Infantino in his house, and he watches Ray leaving, and Joey Butters thinks to himself, "Christ, nothing good happens when you answer the doorbell these days." Butters moved to the front window that overlooked the street. A minute later, he watched as the PI left the front door. He felt the guy's presence still in the apartment, the placid, dusty air, disturbed now by something unexpected, like an afterimage of sharp light. The PI showed a calm demeanor, relaxed even, but behind that, his eyes had been searching all over and through, not asking permission. What a day, this old case coming up like a skeleton in a flooded graveyard. He thought back to what he once was, what they all had been so many years ago. Those hot summer nights, everyone young and ferocious, their futures stretching out over the limitless Atlantic horizon. So one of the tension points is, can these detectives get the evidence out of the witnesses' heads? That's the challenge. So I want to show you a little bit about These are by the way, these are the audio books that'll be coming out for the two books, Telegraph Hill and the Burden of Innocence. In terms of innocence cases, as I mentioned, investigation has to tell that story. So I think you can see this here pretty clearly, that wrongful convictions on this yellow line petered out or started out at around less than 50 in 1989, and DNA was starting to be used on these cases. And you kind of see over time how it shoots up. Last year, I think there were 240 or something like that last year. So you can see that upward trend. The interesting thing is this blue line here is DNA cases, which are pretty steady, so they kind of go right along. They usually stay right around 25, 30 years. So I think that proves the point that this red line, which you can see, those are all the non-DNA cases. And those are the cases that require investigators of the type that I put into this book, The Burden of Innocence. And you can just see how it shoots up. In particular, I got involved around this year, 2003, and then it just shoots up and it goes up year after year. You see every day there's a story now, and it really has shaken the justice system such that funding is flowing into these types of cases and testing. And I want to show you a real case just to give you an example of how somebody might use, how some of these cases go and how you might take certain parts of a case and write a book about it. So this case is the Gary Sifazari case from 2019. It was a brutal rape murder from Milford, Massachusetts in Worcester County. This is a 75-year-old grandmother, Concetta Chiappa. This is Michael Giroux, whose DNA was found at the scene. This gentleman on the right is Gary Sifazari, who was actually convicted of the crime. So he was convicted on what we call junk science, which is, in this particular case, bite mark evidence, which has now been discarded. And we were able to obtain DNA testing in 2019, which pointed to this gentleman. Look at those eyes. And it all pointed, this guy was a state police and FBI informant. And remember how I said the DNA does not solve all cases and you need to tie the story together? The prosecutors in this case did something very, very typical. What they did was they ended up saying, we know the DNA points to Michael Giroux and we know that he's a police informant, but it doesn't prove that your guy wasn't there. So they, all these years later, instead of freeing him from prison, they tried to make it sound as if our client was with Mr. Giroux at the scene. That's the trick that they sometimes do. So my job was basically to conduct a thorough investigation of Mr. Giroux, everything that he was about. What did he do? What other cases did he testify in? And I spent almost 6 months detailing his life, his history of violence, his history of crime. He killed a landlord in Rhode Island. And I could tell you about all these 90 pages or 90 plus pages that we did on Mr. Giroux to document the life. But what I would do if I was to write a book about him and put him in there is I would tell you this story. So during an interview with one of his girlfriends, his ex-girlfriends, she was a partner of the landlord who was killed by Mr. Giroux. And she was talking to me. She had these rings on her fingers. She wore these big, beautiful rings as she was talking. And she was telling me, a little bit about her experiences with this guy. And she told me that the trial testimony included a part where Mr. Giroux had confessed to carrying bolt cutters to the scene. Why? Because if they weren't sure which of the two they were going to rob that night, whether it was the guy that they eventually killed or it was Mr. Giroux's ex-girlfriend. And he wanted to be prepared because if it was his ex-girlfriend, he wanted to steal those rings. And he would use the bolt cutters to remove the fingers. So that one detail, ladies and gentlemen, do I really need 90 pages of reports to tell you about this guy? Or does that image of the bolt cutters and the rings say everything? That to me is fiction. That's what you would put in the crime novel. So we exonerated Gary Sifazari in 2019, and he's been free since. Some of the other cases that I've worked on have involved James Watson, seen here, also right in the middle of the pandemic. And some of you might remember Dennis Mayer, who lives in the Tewksbury area, and I worked on his civil case back in the early 2000s. He's a terrific guy. Who knows, maybe he's even on here watching. And then another case from the area is Victor Rosario. So Victor was convicted of arson in the 80s, and last May, he received a $13 million settlement. This is us at the press conference, and then we celebrated with the law firm that represented him in the civil case in Chicago. And I got this great picture of him standing in front of Trump Tower, and I crossed out Trump and I put Rosario. So we sent that to his family, and they all loved it because they think that he bought Trump Tower in Chicago. So, and then this is one final thing. I don't know if this is going to play here, but I'm going to try to play it for you. This is an incredible scene. This is actually a scene that occurred a couple months ago from a prison in Massachusetts, where a client is actually walking out of jail. And you talk about how abrupt it is. The court system granted him parole. We're still working to overturn his conviction. And then this is literally what they do. You get a bag of clothes and you walk out the prison front door. And his legal team from the New England Innocence Project and me, we were all there to greet him. And this is what it looks like. I hope that sound's coming through.
So John, the sound's not coming through, but the video is working.
Okay.
If the sound is necessary, you can stop share, and then when you reshare, make sure to click the sound share button on the bottom left corner of the page.
That's fine. I just wanted you guys to see this because I just think it's such a dramatic moment to actually see him coming out. And this is how it's done. You literally walk out of prison with your clothes on your back and a bag of your belongings. So that is it. And so I think you can see that this is really fantastic work. I think we really need to do better by these people. We need to improve our work in the criminal justice system. There are too many people being wrongfully convicted even now. And the fact that these cases now number over 200, 250 per year, and the number is only going up, I think it really shows, just cries out for reform and more funds to work, because we basically do this on donations and money from the Department of Justice, but there's more work needed. So thank you, everybody.
So folks, let's give John a big virtual round of applause, and we have about 15 minutes for audience questions. If you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A. And if you have any comments you'd like me to share with John, you can type those into the chat. So already have a bunch of questions for you, John. Susan asks, I imagine all prisoners say they are not guilty. So how does the Innocence Project decide which cases to take on?
Good question. So first off, that's actually not true that all prisoners say they're not innocent, because some prisoners want it known that they committed a crime because it may allow them a certain status if the case had a certain notoriety outside of the jail, the prison. So some people, I wouldn't say everybody claims innocence, but it's a great question in terms of how we screen them. It is an exhaustive process. We get hundreds and hundreds of applications through the New England Innocence Project. And then the attorneys and their staff, they have to screen through them. And we end up picking a handful each year that we think have signs of actual innocence. And sometimes I assist with that, where I'll do a couple of interviews during that intake process. But it really is stunning how many people are out there with cases. And, sometimes we're really not sure. We think maybe that would be a good innocence case, but it's not as good as this one. And we think we might be able to actually win this one. So it's just limited resources. We can only do so much in a given year.
An anonymous attendee asks, did you go to Hastings? Because I did.
I did attend Hastings, and that is why I was referencing the Tenderloin, because the tough Tenderloin district, of course, is home to Hastings Law, University of California. Yeah.
Virginia, and by the way, I should thank a couple of libraries here. Let me pull this up. So I want to thank the Hanover Library and Westboro Library for helping Tewksbury promote tonight's talk. Virginia says, you mentioned light bulb moments from quotes in interviews. Do you ask permission to use those? I've surprised folks by asking.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I write up a report for the actual case, I quote witnesses verbatim, because we're going to use those quotes potentially in the case if they're relevant. What I do as a fiction writer is I tweak it. So, there's sort of that joke about writers that we're always stealing from our family and friends when we have conversations, but I usually tweak things. I don't go verbatim. I guess that's the writer in me. I'm always thinking I can improve it, and maybe I don't, but I do feel some obligation, in particular if there's a quote that I learn on a case.
All right, so this is like 3 questions in one. I'm going to ask these slowly here, one at a time. An anonymous attendee asks, how would one of us go about becoming a private investigator?
So as I mentioned, I came through it by basically harassing a private investigator, but I don't recommend that. I also engaged in a shouting argument, which he apparently viewed as a good thing because he hired me that day, but that was his style. I think if you really wanted to do the work, there are some training courses, but there are more certificate courses. I really think just getting a degree that teaches you how to write is the most important things, because most of the people that I work with that are really good at this, they came from an investigative reporter background. They did not come, most of my colleagues tend to be reporters or former reporters. So that's the real skill, because you have to generate a lot of writing. You need to do research, and oftentimes, reporters are great at that. So that's getting that kind of background, and then maybe volunteering at some sort of agency might get you some, some ability to find out if you were good at this type of work and wanted to do it.
So let's see here. Are most investigations boring and not crime novel worthy? What's the typical PI investigation that you do? Well, describe a typical investigation.
Well, I would say that my firm may be a little atypical because I have such a large percentage of criminal work that comes in. That's by design. That's what I love to do. So I'm doing criminal defense, and I'm doing this Innocence Project work as well. I do have a sizable civil part, which is much less PI novel, and you could still write a crime novel about some civil cases because people do very nasty things in civil court. People always seem to think criminal courts and people who are in criminal courts are really nasty. No, that's not true. People who are in civil courts are equally nasty when it comes to money. I don't know if it makes as fun of a crime novel, but it really depends on the type of firm you set up. Some people only do surveillance cases for insurance companies. So that's one of the great things about this job is it's fantastic for men and women, because women have really burst into this profession in a way that was not seen before, when it was mostly retired cops years ago. So it's a great profession. You can kind of tailor your agency to whatever type of work you want to do.
And final question from the anonymous attendee. They ask, how does the private investigator decide which clients to take on versus which not to? So I know you talked kind of about the Innocence Project and how they vet, but what about an individual private investigator? How would they
Yeah.
generally decide what client to take on versus which not to?
So that reminds me of a quote from, I mentioned that gentleman in San Francisco, Hal Lipset, whose agency spawned so many firms. He used to say he would take any client whose check cleared the bank. But I think realistically, as you get more settled and more well-known in the field, you can kind of pick and choose and tailor the work that you want to do. So I just like to work with people who are easy to work with, number one, which sounds funny, but I will not take on clients that I feel like sort of are looking for like an abusive relationship. Like I'm certainly not going to do anything for them. I mean, there's very hard, fast legal lines that we adhere to. And we oftentimes run into clients who think if they pay us enough money, we'll stick a GPS tracker on any car or something like that. It's not going to happen. So you're really just looking for, interesting cases. And I focus mostly on law firms, but I do take private clients and I make sure that I vet them very carefully, make sure that they have a real case and there's not some ulterior motive to hiring a detective.
So Rosamond is curious if you have read John Grisham's The Guardians, and I also know that Grisham wrote a nonfiction book about 20 years ago called The Innocent Man, but I know he's written several books about sort of innocent people being found guilty. Have you read any John Grisham books along those lines?
I have not. It's funny. It's not. I know certainly about the Innocent Man because that's a book that often comes up. And to his credit, he was on target with that kind of just what I was saying about how those cases were blowing up in the early 2000s. He wrote a book about it, which is great. But I tend to read more PI novels more than legal thrillers. Sure. Just a preference.
So Mary asks, what percentage of wrongly convicted are convicted murderers?
I would say most of the cases that we take tend to be murder cases, although there's a significant number of rape cases as well. And the rape cases, as you can imagine, because of the type of case, oftentimes do have DNA involved, and the testing can be very, very useful in those. So you're really talking about those major crimes being handled by the Innocence Projects, rape and murder. And it actually raises a scary question because all these other cases that are out there, like assaults that might have resulted in some jail time or even manslaughter cases, we're not even looking at those cases. We don't even have the bandwidth to do it. So there's speculation that there are thousands and thousands of innocent people in prison, and that's only talking about major crimes. That's not talking about other types of cases where somebody might have pled guilty because they don't have money for an attorney or they're just so frustrated with the process. It's daunting.
Marianne asks, to me, what you do is a sort of social justice activity. Do you see this as such?
I do. I mean, I think, to be very candid, I think I do it for selfish reasons. I think I'm good at it and I love it. So that was my original reason. But at the same time, I'll never forget the first time working on some of these cases and watching, in particular, I don't know why, James Watson come out in the middle of the pandemic. And, we were in a parking lot and we got a call that the jail was going to release him, just like I showed you in that video. And the attorneys had to drive down to Norfolk prison, pick him up in a van. He had a mask on. They had masks on. They had to get tested. And he had to have a place to stay, which turned out to be his sister's. And I remember being in the parking lot, watching that van come in, and James is 6'7", and he stepped out of that van, and you see a 6'7" guy like this. That blew me away. I mean, it was such an image of feeling like I actually did something really good here for somebody that nobody can ever take away. Not that the other cases weren't, but there was just something about that, that year, like everything, we all have our pandemic memories. Everything was so intense. And I drove around. I remember the empty streets in Boston because nobody was commuting, with music playing for like 3 hours after. I couldn't go home. I had adrenaline running through my body, just driving up and down. Nobody was on the road. It was, so yeah, it's a great feeling. I mean, it really, really helping some people that are defenseless in a lot of ways.
So folks, we'll take about 5 more minutes of questions. An anonymous attendee asks, how do you get people who are hesitant to open up to you?
You have to really, that's the most sensitive thing that we do. You really have to be patient. There are witnesses that I work with for years before they're willing to talk. And they'll tell me, and sometimes they all but tell me, like, I know something about your case, but I'm not going to talk to you. And you have to be really careful. You can't overstep, you can't over pressure. But I try to always let them know that I'm always around. I'm going to be working on this for the rest of my life if I have to. And believe it or not, you get calls from people sometimes years later or months later. It's a real, I think that's the art of it, really. And that's what I tried to put into the book a little bit, was the type of questioning that you use. It's almost its own whole topic you could go into, but it really is difficult. And that's why I think some of us are really drawn to this, because it's a real challenge, and it really means so much to get somebody to come over and actually tell you something that can change somebody's life.
Kathy has a question about your background. She's wondering if you are also a licensed attorney.
I am, yeah. So when I went to law school in California,
right,
I took the bar exam and then started working for the PI agency. So I figure if I went through 3 years of law school, I didn't want to not take the bar exam. And
yes,
yeah, so I am a licensed attorney as well.
Francine asks, have you read Ronald Balsam's books? If you have, what do you think about his detective ability?
I am not familiar with those books. I'm sorry, I can't comment on that.
That's
but
okay.
I'll look them up.
We do have a question in the chat. Patricia asks, how does someone volunteer their time to the Innocence Project?
So the Innocence Project, because the work is complex, they do have a staff of interns and lawyers that are screening through the cases. But, they're always looking for help in terms of getting awareness out there, because that's part of it. It's just people still feel like, well, if somebody's in prison, they're guilty. But that mindset has changed dramatically. And part of it is through the help of volunteers who show up at rallies and show up at events that we do. So I think if you're interested, if you just started coming to some events, we do a lot of public events out there. We have one coming up in September, I think, at the City Winery in Boston, and there'll be others. We've done marches, fundraising, and there is volunteer opportunities there for sure.
We got 2 more to go here. One fun and one not so fun. An anonymous attendee asks, are there any cases that haunt you? Maybe one that you couldn't solve, or maybe one where there was an unjust result despite the evidence?
Yeah, definitely. There's a client in prison to this day that we feel like there was a confession from a person who has a special protected status under the law, what's basically known as the priest penitent privilege. So if you confess something to your priest, can the priest release that information? That became the legal issue in that case. And he's an Arabic gentleman who's been in prison for years, and it occurred right during the 1980s, at the height of sort of the the Iranian Revolution. So I feel like the jury probably really didn't like him based on sort of the political climate. And that case haunts a lot of us. We feel like he's innocent, and we don't know what to do with it. It's bitter.
On a different note, I think this might be your mother or something. Lynn writes, hi, John, this is your family watching in Dedham. Great job. And Dad says he wants his Robert Parker books back.
No way. You gave them up, so they're staying on my bookcase, Papa.
There you go. So folks, let's give John a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation and Q&A. John, I'll circle back to you in 30 seconds. But folks, look for an email from me later tonight with a link to this recording, a link to a feedback survey, and information about some other upcoming virtual programs that might be of interest. and I didn't really plan this, but in 3 weeks, we happen to have an FBI profiler coming to talk to us. So we're sort of going with a little bit of a true crime series. John, I want to really thank you for a great night. Do you have any last words for the audience before we wrap it up?
I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. I really appreciate it. These events are wonderful. And Robert, thank you again for having me. This is terrific. And maybe we'll do it again sometime.
All right, sounds good. When your third book comes out, hit me up, John. So
Excellent.
Thank you all. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their evening. Have a great night.